Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you have been enjoying the delicious lunch. I'd like to take this moment now to introduce those guests that we have seated at the head table this afternoon. It's been a long day for me. I don't know about the rest of you. But yes, we'd really love to get our keynote speaker up here quickly. So I will ask you to hold your applause as I announce the names of our head table guests today. We have Simon Pascoe, the General Manager, BC Works, Rio Tinto. Tyler Bannock, the Manager, Public and Government Affairs with CN. Ken Veldman, Vice President, Public Affairs and Sustainability, Port of Prince Rupert. Chris Farnes, Vice President of Sustainable Development at Cisco. Emily Black, Director, Gas Business Development, Enbridge. We're joined today by our afternoon keynote speaker, the Honourable Julie Daberson, Parliamentary Secretary, Government of Canada. Chief Chris Roberts of Wewakam Nation, Chief Darlene Logan of the Lheidli T'enneh, and our keynote at lunch, our Regional Chief Terry Teegee, BC Assembly of First Nations. So welcome. And now I'd like to invite Ken Veldman, Vice President, Public Affairs and Sustainability of Prince Rupert Port Authority, our lunch sponsor today. It's my pleasure to invite him to the stage to introduce our keynote today.
Good afternoon. Always a pleasure to be welcome to the traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. And I bring greetings from the territory of the Somaliac-speaking Tsimshian people, in whose traditional lands and waters we operate as a port. I'm very pleased to be a sponsor. I'd like to specifically recognize and thank for the attendance of the leaders of communities, in particular Indigenous communities, of industries, employers, labor, and government who made the time to be here. My personal history with this conference goes back 20 years to its beginnings when I was a member of Initiatives Prince George right here in this community. And from a port perspective, given our role in exporting BC's natural resource products, that strong connection continues. Ports are fundamentally instruments of trade, not just transportation. This natural resource forum provides an opportunity for all of us to consider the importance of international trade, and it's certainly there within our theme this year, that underpins the success of our natural resource economy and the relationships that enable it. It's an important program to discuss opportunities and issues that are fundamental to the economic future of not just northern BC, but the province as a whole. It's been a tough time to be in the port business over the last couple of years. And in fact, in Prince Rupert, we just recorded our second straight year of decline. And that is not an environment that we are used to. And that's not good news for northern BC. Port growth delivers economic benefits, employment, and competitiveness for businesses and workers right across this region, from Terrace to Prince George to Fort St. John and everywhere in between. The pandemic itself really shone a bright light on the weaknesses and points of exposure that our global supply chain has, and it really caused disruption over the past 2 years. We're also witnessing at the same time a rapidly changing global energy demand in a period of geopolitical tension that has highlighted global energy security. So it's been extremely volatile and extremely dynamic. Trades and supply chains are evolving incredibly rapidly right now to better deliver in this new reality. And I gotta tell you, it is a competition. So despite this current volatility though, PRPA and its partners are making strides towards developing the competitive, sustainable gateway of the future for this country. More diversification, more capacity, expanded services. This is very good news for northern BC. The Port of Prince Rupert has an advanced development portfolio right now that features over $2 billion of private sector investment waiting to be deployed. And to connect them to those global trends that I noted earlier, they're targeted at, number one, intermodal container import and export supply chains that promise to provide new opportunity for every industry to consider containerization as a way to add value to products destined for international markets. And number two, energy supply chains, and ensuring that Canada has a key role to play as a trusted global energy provider through every step of our transition to a low-carbon world. And I'll make two comments related to delivering on that, quite frankly, generational investment opportunity that we're seeing. One, as a country, we have to find ways to get the right projects across the finish line on a competitive timeline. We heard the Premier speak about this yesterday, and we were heartened by that sentiment. But I would suggest that our recent track record has not been encouraging. From a Prince Rupert perspective, 2023 will be an absolutely pivotal year for decisions to be made on projects that have been years in the making and are competing globally for the capital required to execute on them. The second point is solutions and success are based on forging real partnerships. And we have to get even better at this too. And there's no more important area for partnerships than with Indigenous communities. We're proud of our history of partnerships with Tsimshian communities in the North Coast, particularly in the area of entrenching Indigenous economic and employment benefits into the growth of the port. But we know much work remains to be done, and some of the challenges can be extremely complex, which is a natural segue to our luncheon speaker. Teegee is the Regional Chief for the BC Assembly of First Nations and has proven to be an important voice for Indigenous communities in BC. I'm looking forward, as always, to hearing his perspective and advice. Terry's ancestry is Dakal, Gitxsan, and Sekani descent. He is a member of the Takla Nation. As a former registered professional forester, he tells me recovering professional forester, we'll leave that, responsible for looking after the forests, forest lands, and forest resources, Terry's very deeply involved in natural resources development. And as a regional chief, he was an instrumental voice in the development and, frankly, historic passing of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Please join me. Welcome Terry Teegee to the podium.
Thank you, Ken. Deniza, Tsekuza, Skyza, Samoyga, Simanak, Simawagat, chiefs, hereditary chiefs, delegates, elders, youth. First of all, I want to acknowledge the territory of the Lheidli T'enneh, the unceded, unsurrendered, continually occupied territory of the Dakat people. I want to thank the Lheidli T'enneh Chief and Council for allowing us to be here in this room and in their territory to discuss these very important matters in regards to natural resource development. Yeah, that's, I was going to say, damn Alcan. It was the wrong slide deck. So I just want to preface and congratulate this vision of having this meeting 20 years ago. Minister Pat Bell wanted to bring everybody together, not only industry, government, but a small voice back in those days, in 2003, were First Nations. And 20 years ago, it doesn't seem like that far away, but it seems so long ago. 20 years ago, I think 50 Cent in the Club was #1 hit. You know, we're going through the trilogy of the, I believe, the Lord of the Rings, CSI was the #1 movie. Social media was in its infancy. MySpace was, I don't know if you still have MySpace. You know, my son says I'm a boomer. I'm not a boomer, I'm a Gen X. There's probably a lot of Gen X in here that you know, really have you know, important task of dealing with a lot of these issues. Also, 20 years ago, the world was going through a pandemic as well, not as big as what we've seen the last couple of years, was the SARS pandemic, the cousin to what we've seen, the COVID-19. And in January 2020, we did meet in this room and talk many of the discussions of Indigenous peoples, and we were just 3 short months away of passing Bill C-41, along with my sister organizations, not only the BCAFN, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and First Nations Summit. I know we do have Summit Leadership Council here, Hugh Breaker and Robert Phillips, and I just want to acknowledge them. Was a very important date in terms of recognizing our Indigenous rights, title, and interests. Back in 2003 as well was the development of trying to deal with the land question and the issue of forestry. And in the meetings there during that year were the discussions of developing a new type of tenure, a new type of arrangement with First Nations, and those were called Forest Range Agreements. Very early agreements that saw very little come to First Nations, not only in revenue sharing, but also in terms of tenure. So also that year, my nation, we were going and discussing in our community the development of a mining project called Chemist North in 2003. And what we saw as a mine that was unviable because of the proposal that would dam up what was known in the colonial system as Duncan Lake and what we call Amazay Lake. So we went through that process, and by 2007, the project wasn't viable. It couldn't go forward because it couldn't mitigate the issues of culture and heritage. And if you watched the panel this morning with the Chislada Carrier Nation, Chief Corina Lewin, and Dana Evischek. Dana Evischek was actually one of those that came up to Amazay Lake and did some archaeological work for our nation and determined that there were graves, hearths, many signs of our Indigenous peoples. But the term Amazay is mother caribou. And this is where they reared their young ones. And this is why it was so important for not only the Takla Nation, but also the Tseke, Dene, and Kodacha. And this is why we had so many concerns. So certainly we've come a long way. 04, 05, we saw the decision of the Haida Nation talking about the transferring of tenures, that there was not enough consultation or involvement with First Nations, in particular the Haida. We saw in 2007 a very important date internationally. In September of 2007, the passing of the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from the United Nations. So that was a deliberation of many, many decades of discussions of how Indigenous peoples can be recognized in their countries. And here in British Columbia and Canada, a colonial system that really imposed genocidal policies against Indigenous peoples. So since then, there are certainly more important decisions to recognize, including the Chilcotin in 2014, June 26, and more recently, the Blueberry decision that really saw the issues of cumulative impacts. The Chilcotin decision also at the Supreme Court of Canada determined that First Nations have title. These were very important not only for British Columbia, but Canada, but internationally. So despite the fact that we do have a number of these decisions, I consider them as part of our toolbox, if you will. And a big part of that is the passing of Bill C-41, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples in this province. We're well over 3.5 years in implementing the declaration, and a year and a half in terms of implementing Bill C-15, which is the federal United Nations Declaration Act. So these are very important instruments that we are living in, especially here in British Columbia, because really British Columbia is leading the way, not only nationally but also internationally, in terms of recognition of Indigenous rights, title, and interests. So, 20 years ago, too, personally, was the birth of my daughter, very important, my firstborn. And that's, definitely changed my life and saw the importance of why we need to recognize our rights, title, and interest, and how that's going to affect the next generation. And back in 2003, Kraken was just a sea monster or a bottle of rum. Now, it's the Seattle Kraken NHL hockey team and a COVID subvariant, the Kraken variant. So, how things have changed over the last 20 years is certainly, something that you don't see what the future is going to bring. But what we do have in control of is, our behaviors and our relationships, and also partnerships, not only with industry, but also with government. So it's really important to have these relationships and develop these relationships, and also recognize that there are other governments, including First Nations, out there. And this is why it's so important at this event, especially this one being one of the biggest conferences in regards to natural resource development in BC, why we need to be here. And I want to recognize the 30-plus chiefs that are here, the hereditary chiefs, the leaders, the councillors. A big change in the last 20 years is more and more economic development First Nations officers out there that are creating those new partnerships with many private industry and also with government. Certainly, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples is an advocacy for change, the change of relationships, and certainly was historic in the making back in 2007, but implementing it is a bigger task. Certainly, I think, when we passed the declaration back in 2019, one of the comments that was made by previous Premier Horgan was that we don't want to keep going to court. We don't want to keep losing in court. So we need to recognize the rights, title, and interests of Indigenous peoples here in British Columbia. And certainly it is a reconciliation, this term that we continue to hear now more than ever over the last 10 years is reconciliation and restitution for our Indigenous peoples. And moreover, as a governing body, Indigenous peoples want more governance over natural resources and within their traditional territories. In particular with decision making, how decisions are made, how it's going to affect our Indigenous peoples in our traditional territories, but also the opportunities that can be afforded to our First Nations to develop wealth, not be completely dependent on government coffers and program funding that are woefully underfunded. And this is why we need more involvement in terms of economic development and more revenues to our First Nations communities. Certainly, UNDRIP was adopted at General Assembly, 143 countries to 4. One of the 4 was Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and USA. I want to recognize that they did fully adopt in 2016. And by 2019, as we've seen, DRIPA, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, DRIPA, was passed by BC. And more recently, in 2021, as I said, the United Nations Declaration Act by the federal government. So as a part of my job as a regional chief, we hold portfolios. The biggest portfolio I do hold right now is implementing UNDRIP, the Declaration Act nationally, and developing an action plan for the many of our First Nations across this country. We do have an action plan regionally here. There's 89 commitments over 5 years, looking at the priorities of our many 204 First Nations communities here in British Columbia that are attempting to align many of the federal or the provincial colonial laws with the United Nations Declaration. So despite the fact that it has been slow going, there has been progress. So there is good news there, but it certainly could be a lot better. Certainly, First Nations has key partners, and as many First Nations, many panels before in the last 20 years is early engagement. Free, prior, and informed consent in any development. It's better to have First Nations in partnership than without them, and coming to First Nations after the fact. Certainly local profits, local investments, and over the last few days and last week, what we've seen with the decisions over the closing of a pulp line here in Prince George that will see the laying off or the elimination of 300 jobs. This is why it's so important that many local governments, and more importantly, I think for First Nations, to have more of a say in terms of what is going on here. The Claytley people are not leaving. This is their territory. They're not leaving. My nation, Takla, we're not leaving Takla. Many nations that are adjacent or are neighboring other urban communities, we are not leaving. This is where we come from. Our interests are in our communities, and it is local. And this is why it's so important to have investments with First Nations communities. This is why it's so important that I say that much of the resources land with the First Nations, because our local interests, and if you look around here in northern British Columbia, the vast majority of our First Nations come to Prince George for shopping, for anything that they need back in their communities. Our money stays here. And this is a bit of a problem that we have, a real conundrum where many of our communities are dependent on corporations, massive corporations that, does the majority shareholder of Canfor have interest in Prince George or Takla or Claytley or Saikas or any other First Nations? Does an investor in Bay Street have any interests of where their money comes from or how it affects not just the people, but the environment, the issues that we are dealing with as First Nations? I could safely say no. So it's better for our First Nations to take over these areas and more of the resources being held by First Nations. For the last 20 years, we've definitely seen the climate emergency emerge as more of an issue, a bigger issue. What we're seeing in California, what we've experienced the last couple of years. 2003, we saw massive fires in Kelowna, which really began the discussions of what we're going to do about the issues of fire, mitigating the issue of the mountain pine beetle. So it's really important that First Nations are part of these discussions. On a higher level and provincial level, we do have a BC First Nations climate strategy, and it is coming back to how local decisions are made and how we implement UNDRIP on a local level, especially in terms of emergencies. We've all witnessed on the news what happened to Lytton First Nation. And there too, Lytton First Nations aren't leaving. They're going to stay, they're going to rebuild, and they're staying. And their goals is to have more of a community, a safer community. And it speaks to our governance in terms of Indigenous peoples when we're dealing with climate emergencies. How do we deal with emergencies? So certainly those discussions have, I'm glad to say, progressed for having more involvement of First Nations. Indigenous economy in Canada is an estimated $32 billion. Certainly that number, if you start to include other partnerships, it's certainly not higher. Indigenous female entrepreneurs growing twice the national rate. And the youngest and fastest growing population, once again, are First Nations in Canada. And one of my portfolios nationally is employment and training, and we look at these stats and go to the government and say, hey, we need more training. Hey, industry, government, we have a burgeoning youth movement, if you will, population that can potentially fill those jobs. So it's really important to have those discussion. One of the things I've also been working on economic development is to develop a Center of First Nations Excellence, and I want to acknowledge the BC government for putting forward resources. Some of the work that we did with the BC Business Council, Greg D'Avion, I know you're here. We do have a champions table with a number of leaders and chiefs. We came together to talk about how to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, talk about implementing UNDRIP, and we developed a guidebook. It's called the Black Books. You can find it on our BCFN website, and it's for our First Nations communities. Really a guidebook to help our communities to build some capacity, to look at how to deal with a number of issues in terms of economic development, whether it's engagement with industry, engagement with government, what do partnerships look like, et cetera, et cetera. So as a complement to this is to start developing a center of excellence, a go-to where our First Nations communities can seek help or advice, an office where we can really develop a lot of this information. We've, at the BCFN, we've done several reports, including a health and wellness report, which is, we're not looking at GDP as a safe place to look at our First Nations, where we are landing. We definitely are low on the grand scheme of things. Health and wellness, certainly, we're not up there in terms of where we should be. And if the pandemic is any indication, we had the highest rates of infection, the highest rates of death. So certainly health and wellness is a good indicator of where we're at in the grand scheme of things. So these reports are really helpful for our First Nations communities and to inform government and industry, why we need to make changes and why we need to be more involved with, how First Nations in terms of how decisions are made. Certainly, as a term, reconciliation and governance, the last couple of years we've seen this discussion over an apology from the Vatican, and the Pope had the opportunity there. I think the term reconciliation and apologies are great, but we need to enact them. We need to put something behind it. And over the last year, we've seen Section 6 and 7 agreements, which are great, giving more opportunity for our First Nations to have involvement in decision making. We've also had certainly more tenures are going to First Nations. More recently, the Carrie-Sakani and other First Nations throughout the province. That is great. So this is enacting, I would say, reconciliation, and certainly more jurisdiction and decision making. So I just want to leave this conference with that of where we come in the last 20 years, how massive things have changed in terms of dealing with many of the natural resources issues, because ultimately, with unregulated profiteering, there is a cost to that. And the costs are jobs, the costs are to the people, where much of this natural resources does come from. So we need to be a part of those decisions. Local governments need to be a part of those decisions, and together we make good decisions together. And certainly we've seen that seismic change. 20 years ago, it used to be just, we can offer you jobs, maybe an impact benefit agreement. All that has changed. The lexicon is more of partnerships, is equity, it's decision making. It's gone from very minimal involvement in terms of economic development to more and more. So that's a good sign. So that being said, previous to becoming the regional chief, I was the tribal chief of the Carrie-Sakani, and in the development of the natural gas pipelines, there was an initiative started called Environmental Stewardship Initiative. And I would like to invite Jackie Thomas, former chief of Sycuz First Nations, who has done a lot of work back when I was at the Tribal Council on this initiative, environmental stewardship initiative, which purpose was to deal with many of the cumulative impact issues on the land. And I invite Jackie up to take the microphone to speak to this. And it's a good news story because it's going to be expanding. So thank you, Masicho. Jackie.
Thank you, Terry, for the kind introduction. I've been involved in the Environmental Stewardship Initiative since its inception in 2014. I don't know if we have the, oh good, we have the slide deck up, okay. Okay. I was asked to come and do this announcement at this forum, and it's my own suggestion and recommendation from our last governance meeting. So that's why I'm here. Thanks, Lori. Masi, Dai, Government Dai, Logan, Lately Tene. Masi Cho for having me on your territory and allowing us to do our business here. My name is Jackie Thomas. I've been on council for my community and worked for my community most of my life. I'm an avid hunter, avid fisherman, avid gatherer, and I love my territory. I've been on my territory my whole life. I came to talk about the Environmental Stewardship Initiative. I just have to say that I've been on my territory because sometimes people think we talk about stuff we don't know what we're talking about, and I know very well what's going on the land base. We started the Environmental Stewardship Initiative in 2014 because there was approximately, well, over 20 liquid natural gas proposed pipelines crossing British Columbia. Every First Nation in BC that was involved in the environmental assessment of the pipelines made comment about the cumulative impact loading of this pipeline. So there was a fund established by BC, and First Nations began working on cumulative impact. We began gathering across the north trusted information that our community and BC can use. It was always our goal to make decisions from this information so that it would be more reliable instead of desktop modeling that currently has been making decisions for our territories. We brought together the community stewardship forums and began working together just before the pandemic in 2019, and have been doing that now for a number of years. We have created a proven model for collaborative stewardship in BC that will actually uphold our rights. As directed by Cabinet in 2021, the province, in partnership with our nations, developed recommendations for the long-term vision of the Environmental Stewardship Initiative and Community Stewardship Forums. Last fall, Cabinet ministers endorsed a long-term mandate for this model. We'll jointly develop these recommendations and work together to make sure that the work that's being done on our communities and on our territories are of help to our rights and title. These are five of the joint recommendations that, and I'll just keep it short. We are going to be establishing long-term funding for this model. We will use this model to enable and inform decision-making, and involve this model in operation and strategic planning and begin using it at the legislative levels. We will ensure that the ESI and the CSF are aligning and evolving over time. And we will always support the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as the Declaration Act. We will be developing joint performance evaluation measures together, and we will lead this initiative together, First Nations in BC, as well as BC. We're hoping that we can harmonize a process that will help the fish, the birds, the animals, and the water, not just for Indigenous people, for everybody. Everybody that will come after us, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, will benefit from this. That is our goal. We need to get away from the extinctions that we're starting to see throughout the rest of the world and help this land that we come from. For everybody. And I have to say it for everybody because I see a lot of protests out there. And there are some people that don't agree with doing the right thing for those animals and those fish out there. But it has to be done. This is what our ancestors told us has to be done. And you First Nations out there, you talk to your elders about those prophecies. Because if we're going to turn this world around and get away from the precipice of extinction, we need to be doing this. And we need to be doing this yesterday. So, we have next steps. I told Terry I'll be really quick on this. We will start implementing, and this April in Vancouver, we will be having a gathering to present all the awesome findings from the Environmental Stewardship Initiative as well as our community forums. We would like to onboard other strategic partners to do this work. This work is important. It will help in our decision making and in our planning for resources that are in our territory. So I really encourage industry, I encourage the federal government, again, Canada, to come on board and be our partner in this very important work that will help our survival of some of our species on our territory. And I really thank you for listening, and I'm around, and if you have any questions, and I really want to thank, before I leave, I have to thank all our communities, our First Nation communities, that saw this, that banded together and decided to work together to do this important work, because without those monitors that we have on the land, harvesters that we have on the land, we would never have known of the damage that's out there that we need reparation for. So my hands up to all those land people and all those leaders of those communities that saw the value and decided to work together and get it done. Merci.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to invite Chris Farnes, Vice President of Sustainable Development for Cisco, to the stage to thank Regional Chief Teegee and Jackie Thomas.
Okay, well, there was no preparation involved in this, as you can see, but this is a tough act to follow, hey? And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Lheidli-T'enneh, and I'd like to pay forward a bit of a debt that I owe to Lheidli and to the Carrier-Secani Tribal Council. You know, as a young biologist recently graduated out of UNBC, Lheidli and Carrier-Secani supported me. I worked on fisheries and wildlife projects all through this region. And, so thank you. You sustained my family and gave me a future in this area and with my career. So I appreciate that a lot. And I'm here on behalf of OSISCO. We're a sponsor of OSISCO Development Corporation. We're a relatively new corporation in this area. You might be familiar with Barkerville Gold Mines. That was a company that we absorbed basically as part of OSISCO Gold Royalties, creating this incubator type company where we have 3 different projects. One down by Wells, that's the Caribou Gold Project, that's our flagship project. We have another project in Utah, the Tintic project, and down in Sonora province, or Sonora state of Mexico, we have the San Antonio project. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that. It's going to be about 400 jobs. It's an underground, state-of-the-art underground gold mine. We're going to be all electrified underground. We're building a transmission line out to the area. It's going to be about 400 jobs. So as part of that, my job is sustainability and stuff. So that's what I get excited about. I'm a bit of the softer side of mining. So what we're really proud of and what we're really committed to is, our Indigenous relationships with our Indigenous partners. And I'd like to acknowledge those folks today here. That's the Lataqua Dene Nation out of Quesnel, Hatsuth First Nation, formerly Soda Creek, and the Williams Lake First Nation. And it's through their support that we're moving. This is the first project through the new BC EAO, and it's with the support of our Indigenous partners that this process has been going relatively well. And so we're hoping to be into production probably around 2025. And I would invite anybody who wants to come down and see this evolve. You can stop in for the day in Barkerville and check out Wells, and it's a beautiful area. Do the Bower Lake Loop. It's really a stunning area in the province. And so I heard somebody mention here today about when this forum started. I remember I was here working and living here, and it was what I remember is like somebody said that it was token First Nations here and things like that. And I prefer to think of those folks as courageous pioneers coming here. They weren't tokens. They were people who were stepping out of their comfort zone to come into a relatively non-Indigenous environment, and maybe sometimes a hostile environment, to bring their knowledge and their understanding to us, and that has evolved over 20 years, and so it's really good to see that there's a much larger percentage of Indigenous folks here today, and that's how this should be. It's gaining momentum. It's going to carry us into the future. And I was talking with Terry. Terry and I have a bit of a history. When I was saying I was working with the Carrier Sekani, I was out on the Nechako River one day catching sturgeon, and Terry showed up with a CTV news crew, and he wanted to do the interview right in the back of the boat. So there we were on the Nechako on a cold fall morning, and did the interview. And I could tell then, when I heard Terry speaking, I could tell that he was an inspired leader. He was bringing forth, and he was concerned about the environment. He was talking about sturgeon rehabilitation and what the effects of the Kenny Dam had on the Nechako and stuff, right? So, at that time, he was a rising star, really, and it's really good to see him. And Terry carries on that tradition of bringing that knowledge and understanding to us, right? And so that we can do better, right? And so for that, Musi Cho, Terry, I'm very grateful to have you here.
Thanks for pumping me up, Chris. But I forgot, just wanted to thank Prince Rupert Port Authority as well as the Civic Center. I understand there's going to be a conference here in a couple of weeks, ABCFP, Kofi later on this April. But another one that you should be aware of is First Nations Major Projects Coalition Conference, which is a very, one of the things that when I was a tribal chief, I was a participant of, is on April 24th and 25th in Vancouver at the Western Bay Shore. And it's a good conference. They're expecting well over 1,500, 2,000 people there. If you go, you'll be very pleased with they always have a good diverse panels there, and look forward to seeing some of you there. And shout out to BCIT and Corey Wilson. Is that, I'm kidding. I'm sorry. Thank you all. Masicho.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the Port of Prince Rupert and to Chief Teegee and Jackie Thomas. That concludes our luncheon program. We're going to do a little bit of a different thing this afternoon. We're going to try something new. We're going to have staff come in and clear the plates, and we're going to leave ourselves in some comfortable rounds for this afternoon session. So just make yourselves comfortable or go stretch your legs, and we'll return back shortly. Thank you.